Okay. If you want to record the lecture, you can go ahead and put the computers up front somewhere now. You can just leave yours right there. It'll share it just fine. You need to go ahead and put it on your regular seat. You need to move it.
I'll just set it on the ground.
Okay. Okay, again, just because you're through with your test doesn't mean you start talking. And even after I said stop talking, I saw some people talking. If I do that again, I hate to get nasty, but if I do that again, whoever I see talking, will get a 0 for that failing quiz. Do not talk. Give other people the same courtesy that you want while you're taking the test. And yes, I know I talk during the test, but I'll make it as brief as I can. Okay. I just found out a couple of days ago, and I just confirmed it today actually. You guys probably already knew this. You can't see your total grade in Canvas, right? You guys knew that? I did not know that. I thought you could. If you are curious about that, then there's nothing I can do to fix it. The reason it does that is because I break my different categories down. So I got like 20% for one thing and 40% for another thing. And if you do that for some weird reason, it won't let you see your final grades, your current final grade. So if you have a question about that, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to send you grade to you. Okay? Second thing, since I just got on to everybody for talking long, you may want to stone me, but it appears that I'm going to be your professor next semester. So, if you love me, then you can cheer. If you hate me, I guess you can boo. Okay. We are talking today about the colonial era and colonial wars. So the question for today actually goes back to last week. Basically, the question is, why did shared government and individual rights become law in England, but nowhere else in the early modern world? Why basically what I'm asking is, why did democracy take hold in England and nowhere else? Some reason and thoughts on that. Name?
I think, Joseph.
Go.
I think shared government and individual rights first started in England because of the conflicts between the nobles and the monarchs. Because the tensions rose because as the monarchs were like based on divine rights, they were like raise taxes for their own purposes.
But they did that in other countries and nothing happened. I mean, the nobles didn't share government. Why do you think that?
Maybe like religion was also like more as powerful as the political power in England, so that like nobles were like had power, you know?
Okay. And I don't know the answer to this question myself. I don't think anybody does. This is just for you. This is just to see what you guys think. Name? Trevino?
Yes.
Go.
I think it's because England at the time was more established than the New World was, because people were just starting to come over. So
I'm not talking about in comparison to the New World. I'm talking about like in comparison to other European countries.
Oh my.
You want me to come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Go.
I think it was mostly because we had established the Magna Carta because of King John, and that really laid the groundwork for the shared government and individual rights, and no one else in the early modern world had that at that time.
But other countries did have rebellions by nobles. Why did it work in England and nowhere else? By the way, if you can answer this question, you probably can write a Nobel Prize winning book. Any ideas?
Not really.
In the back.
Taylor,
Go.
I think it's because like, King John, he was failing like constantly before that. So it kind of like, laid the groundwork for like the nobles to like take advantage of that. Like they were kind of smart and like, they're like, we'll give you money and stuff as long as you sign this. And then that laid the groundwork for future stuff like she said.
But why didn't nobles in any other country do that?
But, like John was just weak. So he kind of like went through it.
Okay.
He wasn't as strong as his brother.
Tompkins.
So you think it was basically a weak king?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they didn't rebel. They didn't like go in guns blazing. They sure they did trap him in a field, but so they did it more by peaceful means and not by force. Because when there's war, there's tension, and tension there's strife between the nobles and the king. So
Well, it was pretty clear that if he didn't sign it, they were gonna remove him from the throne.
true.
So. Okay. Back by the wall.
I think it's because like they
Name.
no Ingrid.
Yeah.
It's because they like had him trapped. Like I don't really know any other noble like rebellion that trapped him in the field. Like what else was he supposed to do but sign the Magna Carta?
And that's true. Typically, in other cases when this happened, somebody just deposed him and took over as king. Why did that not happen here?
Because he. Good question.
Karina.
Go.
I think because England and like Europe was more stronger because they had said like, when they had William wanted to be king, he said yes to Europe because Europe was bigger and stronger than the Netherlands was because he's already king of it, like the Netherlands is smaller.
I mean, England,
Yeah,
Europe is a continent.
I mean,
England is part of that continent. It's a country.
England.
So, okay, so what was your answer again?
Because England was like stronger at the time and probably more developed, and then like places like the Netherlands were weaker, so it probably was better to you.
Okay, maybe. Go.
I think England's rebellion was more powerful because they.
God, you sound bad.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think they had more people rebelling because of high taxes whenever they were fighting against France.
But other countries also had high taxes. Who else?
Dominant.
Go.
I feel like it's because England had parliament to represent them, while other places, like, it was mainly just, like, you listen to the head of that government. and say-
Well, but Parliament didn't exist until after the Magna Carta. I mean, the government in England was essentially the same as the government in Spain, or the government in France, or the government in Austria. So why did it morph into something democratic and no one else in Europe did?
Can you come back to me?
Okay,
Kim,
yeah, which one?
Esther.
Esther.
I think it was maybe because when he was signing the Magna Carta, it was like the terms of the Magna Carta was agreeable from both nobles and the king. So it was like, it kind of like it worked because it was like an equal balance of agreement between the two parties.
It was a fairly equal balance, but the king actually was very opposed to it. He just had no choice but sign it or give up being king.
But I think like him being able to negotiate a little bit with that like contract helped a little bit with the.
So once they forced him to begin negotiations, basically he'd taken a step he could never take back. Okay, that makes some sense. Good as mine, yes,
Adams again.
okay.
So, kind of going further on what I said earlier, I really think it works for Europeans and not us because we also had the Glorious Revolution and
Okay,
we.
but I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about other European countries. We weren't even existing. This was, the Magna Carta came before there was even a colony.
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead and make your point then.
But there was the Glorious Revolution, and that really kind of just set everything in because of all the different kings and queens, everybody kind of became tired of going back and forth, as we had said, and Parliament had stepped in, and because everybody was so tired of going back and forth between the Church of England and Catholicism, we all kind of agreed to go with individual rights and shared government with the Glorious Revolution. And other places, I think there were lots of rebellions, but I don't think there was anybody to really step in and say, hey, like, we found a new king and queen and they can take over. They just kind of had rebellions and stuff like that happened.
Okay. Someone else. In the very back,
They were dead.
okay?
It's really just like barely adding on to that. I feel like it's because, you know, King William and Queen Mary, like, they were not like chill, but they were like willing to like give in to what the like barons and like Parliament people wanted. And, like other people weren't, they wanted to keep their power. It's like they're, you know, how you said in the previous lectures, like, you want to rule a small, like, kind of rich nation, you want to rule a big empire, and they just took the sacrifice. So I feel like it was a set of unique conditions that brought them in there.
That's definitely accurate. That's exactly what happened. And maybe it lies in that because usually what happened was somebody took charge of the rebellion when there was one, and they just overthrew the king and became the king themselves. Nate,
Clark.
go.
I think mainly because at the time England was more developed than any other country than in Europe, and in the less developed countries, I feel like everyone was kind of on the same page and like financially wise, so they were more reliant on like the government. So rebelling and being angry about the absolute government wasn't certainly a thing they could do. So in England, there were more like rich people and more financially stable people to be able to be like, I want it.
That's an interesting take. Essentially what you're saying is that instead of being so poor they revolted, they were so rich they revolted. They had enough and they don't want to lose it all, everything they gained. I hadn't thought about that. That could be. That could be. That's a very well made point. All of these are. I didn't intend for it to be. Turns out this is a very hard question. The same struggles that you guys are having, they had in my first period class. So I don't feel like there's something wrong or something. You guys are right in the middle of it. Maybe a few more. We can address this some way. Don't make me beg you or order you. Okay,
Perillo,
go.
I kind of agree with what Clark said about, it was kind of like the timing of everything. Like, England was more developed, so I feel like it would have been inevitable for them to go first in doing like shared government and individual rights, and like all the other like countries and stuff would have come later because England was like more developed and everything.
And they did. I mean, other countries did come later. So again, maybe you're onto something. Essentially, I mean, now all of Europe is essentially democratic. All of Western and Central Europe is essentially democratic. And all of them had a crunch point. The French had their revolution. All of them had a crunch point where they were saying, you know, this is where the government has to change. One thing that is different, though, who was it that was talking about it being reason? Was that you? Yeah. In France, it definitely happened because the people were so poor they were starving. And that's when they started the French Revolution, which started them on a very long trail. The French Revolution didn't make everything democratic. It did kind of the same thing the Magna Carta did in England. It started them on a several hundred years trail that led to democracy. A couple more. Come on, feel dumb like the rest of us. I need 3 more people. Rojas. Oh, go ahead.
Cloutier.
Saved Rojas.
I just like kind of agree with like what he said about like the king being weak and like that the people like noticed it and that's why they like forced him to do it because they knew he would like give in unlike other people, like other places in like the world.
So just the right guy at the right time.
Yeah.
They found a guy that was weak enough to give in to them and stupid enough not to be able to govern well.
Yeah.
And, okay, maybe. That answer's as good as any. Okay, now Ms. Rojas. Rojas. Ah, yes. I'm sorry? You're not gonna be right. None of us are right. We're all talking about something here that we don't know the answer to, so just give it your best shot.
I think maybe because like obviously other countries have like conflicts, like a lot of them. But I feel like England was more like a progressing like country or something. So as like a country progresses, like development is quicker.
So when you get development in one area, you get development in other areas. And England was basically moving forward. So, and they were. I mean, England was always kind of on the forward edge of things economically. So, maybe so. One more. Y'all are all hiding under your desks back there. Somebody. Go. Name? Go.
I think that because William and Mary were coming from the Netherlands and they're like coming from like a long line of heirs and there were like no more heirs to take over England because there were 2 people now ruling England. I think they were like thinking like individual rights because people were suffered by like Catholicism or like the Church of England.
Okay, I mean, I was kind of looking at the other end, because there are 2 ends to this thing. One is John, and the other is William and Mary. But I think your point's pretty well made regarding William and Mary. In fact, once William and Mary agreed to sign their agreement to the Bill of Rights, every king from thereafter had to. Because no king had a leg to stand on saying not. William and Mary did it, so why won't you do it? And if you wanted to stay king, that's the price of being king in England. Okay, I realize this is a hard one. As I said, when I wrote this question down, I had no idea it would stump everybody as much as it did. And the funny thing is, then when we got in class this morning, it stumped me as much as it did everybody else. There isn't a good, clear answer for this, but at least y'all gave me some things to think about, so I appreciate that. And those of you who did this today, somewhat against your will because I coerced you, thank you very much, I appreciate it. Give yourselves a hand. Yeah. Okay, so now, let's talk about the colonial era and colonial war. The first thing I want to do is explain the colonial relationship to you. Now, what I'm going to talk in terms of England and the American colonies that became the United States. But what I'm going to say pretty much applies to any country that has colonies and to any colonies that a country has. all of the colonies that became the United States were settlement colonies. We talked about that the other day. All the colonies that became the United States were settlement colonies, but what we're going to talk about today would apply, or what I'm about to talk about would apply to administrative colonies just the same. Basically, England was, they didn't have a lot of natural resources. They were a rich country, but they were rich because of trade and manufacturing. They didn't have a lot of natural resources. There's a little farmland, but by this time, by the early 1700s, they were already beginning to get enough population that they would have had trouble feeding themselves. And there was some coal deposits, and that was pretty much it. So the plan was, you go to America or places like America, India, or Africa, wherever, where there are just billions of tons of natural resources of various kind, and you send someone over and you have them harvest those resources, whatever they are. It might be wheat that they grew, or corn, or it might be lumber that you could use to make ships or houses or whatever, or it might be beaver skins that you use to make hats, or deer hide that you use to make belts and shoes. Whatever it was, they harvested the raw materials, they sent them to England, and then England, the factories in England made the finished products and then sent them back out around the world to be sold. It was, from England's point of view, this was all about England. The colonists were not allowed to sell their goods to anyone but England. It had to, when those goods were put aboard ship to sail to England, it had to be an English ship, a ship that was built either in England or in one of the colonies. Colonies basically weren't allowed to have large manufacturing capacities. There was some manufacturing in the colonies, but basically it was only things that reason kind of dictated needed to be there. Small mom and pop operations like shoemakers, wheelwrights and things like that. And then a few, mostly having to do with the shipping industry, a few foundries, or they did do shipbuilding in New England. But mostly they weren't allowed to have any kind of manufacturing, except for very small manufacturing. Everything had to be sent to England. The idea being that England would pay them a price for it, and then they would jack the price way up whenever they sold it, and England would get rich off of it. And England did get rich off of it. That was the source of their wealth. Now, England wasn't the only one doing this. France was doing this, Spain was doing this, some other the Dutch were doing this. Those were probably the big four, but there were other countries that were trying to get into the race as well, and would try, as time passed, as well to get into this, because it is a wealth-making thing. But here's the deal. Despite the fact that England was so limited, the colonies were so limited, they were also wealthy out of this deal. The American colonists from very shortly, you hear the stories about Jamestown and about Plymouth and how they came, and for the first winter they starved and all of that stuff, and that's true. It's all true. But it tends to stop there, and it tends to not say that within 3 or 4 years they were making money, and within 10 years they were making money hand over fist. And they were doing, by the time of the American Revolution, well, even before that, by the time we're talking about today, even when there's colonies, the American colonists had the highest standard of living in the world, even higher than the people of England did. The highest average standard of living in the world. So the whole thing, when we talk about that more, and we will, the whole thing with the split from England wasn't about money or because they were poor or anything like that. but more in line with what some of you were talking about, the fact that they felt like they had certain rights that they were being deprived of, and it was that and not money that really moved them. One of the things that I want to say that I think is important, that's kind of a one-off, it doesn't really fit with anything, but you should know it. And when I say that, I mean in all ways. The first shared government document in American history was the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower came over in 1620. It was the second colony, its first colony in the north. It came over and settled in what is now Massachusetts. And before they got off the ship, they rode up, and everybody, including the ship's crew, signed a document agreeing to how the colony would be governed, and people would have a vote and that sort of thing. And that document is actually older than the Bill of Rights. Question?
Oh, I was just asking the name of the.
Mayflower Compact? Yeah. The Mayflower Compact is actually older than the English Bill of Rights. Now, it's way newer, way younger than the Magna Carta. So that was the first basic law. Over time, there were charters developed for all of the colonies. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry. And so the charters were, each colony had its own charter, and there were some differences, but most of the stuff in the charters was the same stuff. And the way the governments were typically set up is this. The British government appointed a governor. Sometimes that was Parliament, sometimes it was the king. They appointed a governor of the colony. The only exception I'm aware of to that is Connecticut. Connecticut elected their governor. But for all the other 12 colonies, the governors were appointed. Underneath the governor, there was a legislature. The legislature was a two-house legislature, just like the Texas legislature, just like the United States legislature, where they had a Senate and a House of Representatives, or where Parliament had a House of Lords and a House of Commons. In the colonies, they had either an executive council or a legislative council, and they had an assembly. Now let's talk about the councils first. Even though they called it a council, it was essentially the House of Lords or the Senate. It was the upper house. And the executive council and the legislative council worked exactly the same way, with one exception. In an executive council, either the governor or somebody from England, or some pairing of the two, appointed everybody in that council. In a legislative council, they were voted on by the assembly. Not by the people at large, but by the assembly. No colony had both. You just had one upper house, and it was either an executive assembly or a legislative assembly, depending on how it was filled, whether it was filled by appointment or by vote of the assembly. The assembly was the lower house, the equivalent in the United States today of the House of Representatives, or in England today of the House of Commons. It was the lower house. Like the lower houses in England and the United States, even in the colonies, over time the lower houses began to control the money. They did this completely illegally, and the king told them to cut it out, and they just did it anyway. But they essentially kept control of the money. These assemblies were elected by everybody in the general public who could vote. Now, if you look at the little box down there that says the public, and you look at the blue box in there that says voters, that kind of gives you a clue. Not everybody could vote. To vote, you needed to be a man, and you needed to own a certain amount of property. Well, let me back that up a step. You needed to be a white man, and you needed to own a certain amount of property. Women couldn't vote, young men couldn't vote, usually they didn't have the property. By the way, one of the reasons that people liked this, who were in power, who could vote, is because young people could not vote. Most young people did not own property, and your daddy's property didn't count. So you didn't get to vote unless you owned property yourself. Most young people didn't. That kept the government in the hands of the older people in the colonies. That was not an accident. They did that on purpose. Women, of course, weren't allowed to vote. Indians, slaves, African Americans. In most colonies, Jews weren't allowed to vote. They were in Maryland until they got kicked out. So there basically was probably somewhere between a fourth and a fifth of the colony that actually voted on all this stuff. And they voted on the assembly, and then the assembly sometimes voted on the council. If it was a legislative council, they did. The other thing that they did, that all of them did though, is they had the purse strings, and you couldn't get money from the colony unless it was voted on by that elected assembly. The purpose of colonies was for trade to make Britain wealthy. The colonists saw themselves as English subjects, with all the rights and privileges of English subjects. This would be a problem down the road because basically England saw them as colonies. They made no difference in how they treated, no significant difference in how they treated administrative colonies or settlement colonies. The fact that this colony was made up of Englishmen did not change the fact that their role in life was to make England rich. And what they got out of it was a happy byproduct. An unintended consequence as far as England was concerned. There was a trade set up that kind of, and this oversimplifies it a little, but there was a trade set up that everybody was involved in, and Britain controlled that trade. And their purpose in that was to make money. English colonists, we talked about this a little bit last week about some people argue that English colonists were kind of a different breed of cat, and they came over and they did things, because they looked forward to the wilderness and all of that. But if you look closely at what they write and how they acted, that's really not true. And what they basically tried to do was make America sort of a mini England, to recreate England in America. And to give you just an example of that, this is a painting of some houses in England. Look at how those houses are built. Look at that partial wood fence. Look at how crooked the roads are and unpaved and all that. Now, this is a photograph of a recreation of Plymouth Colony, houses in the colonies. If you look at the shape of the houses, they're just the same. The fences were built the same. The crooked roads, unpaved roads, all of that's just the same as it was in England. That was true in a lot of other areas too. A lot of Americans went back to, if they were wealthy, they went back to England to go to the university there to get their education. Fashion, food, our style of government, all of that came from England. And here's an example of the fashion part. And once you see this, I'm going to expect all the ladies to dress in this fashion beginning Thursday. Okay, hold on a second. I don't know why it's not making sound.
Don't need to get dressed in the morning for work. In the 1770s, this is what you were.
Okay. This is a woman getting dressed in the morning. She doesn't show anything, so it's not about how they got dressed and what they wore for the day. What's the view? I'm sorry, I don't know what the deal is here. We're fine this morning. Okay, fine. Sorry. Show comes on, the popcorn comes out, right?
Hi, my name's Leanne, and I'm one of the interpreters at Colonial Mission Mackinac, Mackinac City. And it's true, I'm in my underwear. I am going to show you what it takes me to get dressed in the morning for work. In the 1770s, this is what you were wearing to bed. This is what you would put all the rest of your clothes on. It's called a shift or chemise, kind of a elbow-length sleeves, knee-length skirt. And on top of this is what you build your wardrobe. So I already have my stockings on, but I do not have my girders. And I've learned from lots of experience that it's very important to put these on before you put your stays, because you can't really reach your feet very well. All right, so lacing up your stays. The stays are going to give you the right shape for the 18th century, and they're laced typically in the back, which mine do lace in the back. But they also lace in the front. This is for a working woman. You don't have a person helping you get dressed. So once the stays are on, we've got our skirts. 18th century folks would have probably called them petticoats. These tie on or button on. I forgot my pocket, so we're gonna put that on as well. Pockets are like a pouch that we're gonna put under our skirts. Then I like to put on my kerchief. Sometimes these are called a fichu. They give you a little bit of modesty over the back of your neck. And there's a lot of different ways that you can wear them. I like to tuck mine into my stays because they don't move when we're working. It's nice to know that everything's going to stay where it needs to go. We've got that, and then my jacket is what 18th century people would have always worn over their stays. You're never going outside without your stays or your jumps on. This is where the ladies' maid comes in handy. And then just like the skirts, we don't have zippers or Velcro or anything. So this is actually pinned shut. I have just straight pins. And that's all set. I always wear an apron. Aprons were very functional. They still are functional. Use it as a pocket, carrying firewood. It also works great as a pot holder by the fire. Caps were always worn. They're very fashionable, which we did know about in Michilimackinac, even though we're tucked away in the middle of nowhere. We were aware of fashion, so we've got to look nice. Caps and shoes. I forgot my shoes. So we have those. There's a lot of different styles of shoes at the time period. These are just good leather work shoes. They are nice to wear when we are out and about. They came in different colors as well. Now I'm dressed. I'm all set to go to work for the day. So be sure to stop by Michelin.
Okay, so beginning Thursday, I will expect all you ladies to get up an hour earlier and dress according to history. I really can't imagine what that must have been like. And men dress somewhat the same way. I will be talking about men's clothes sometime during the classes too. It's mostly uniforms and stuff.
Frock coats.
Huh?
Frock coats. I've been looking for a good frock coat pattern.
Good luck. First of all, it befuddles me why somebody would want to take an hour a day just to get dressed. Half an hour to an hour a day. It must have taken at least a half an hour to put all this on. And then the second thing is, can you imagine? You know where Mixlamack is? Mixlamack is in the northern part of Michigan. That's fine for that kind of clothes. Can you imagine wearing that kind of an outfit in North Texas in August? That would have to be miserable. And what the men wore was the same way. Okay, so let's talk about, as I said, they formed a little England, but each of the, I don't have time to go over each of the 13 colonies. But I'm going to go over each of the 3 regions, and we're going to talk about the 3 regions so you have a basic idea. There are things about each colony that were different from the other colonies, but then there were also regional differences. There was a lot of things alike about New England, a lot of things alike about the middle colonies, a lot of things alike about the southern colonies. So New England now consists of 6 states: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. But back at this time, as colonies, there were only 4 colonies. Vermont never became a colony. Vermont, the area that makes up Vermont, was actually being fought over by 4 different groups of people, and sometimes literally fought over with guns. One of those groups of people was the Vermonters, who didn't want to belong to anybody. But New Hampshire also claimed what is now Vermont. New York claimed what is now Vermont, and Massachusetts claimed what is now Vermont. So by the time that was all resolved, we were already a country, and Vermont came in as a state. And now they're part of New England, and they were a part of New England then, but they were never organized as a colony or a territory or anything like that. Maine was a part of Massachusetts until 1950. So there was no Maine. Maine, when they talked about Maine, they were just talking about the separate part of Massachusetts, but it was all Massachusetts at that time. So there were only 4 states, or 4 colonies at that time. These colonies were Congregationalists primarily. As time passed, there were Anglicans there. There were Anglicans everywhere because most of the people, the officials who were appointed by England were Anglican. So there were churches, for them, and there would be ministers who would come over. A lot of them came over from England. So there were Anglican churches all through the colonies. But most of the people particularly in Massachusetts and Connecticut, were Congregationalists. Where we got the Congregationalists has to do with how we initially settled Massachusetts. In 1620, the group that you guys know famously as the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth in Massachusetts, right? You guys are familiar with the Pilgrims, right? Anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about? Well, the Pilgrims, as it turns out, were separatists. Essentially, there were 2 groups of people who didn't like the way the Church of England was being run. They thought it was being run too much like Catholic churches. And so they wanted to change the way it worshiped. Well, one group of them, called the Separatists, which included the Pilgrims that came to America from England by way of the Dutch Republic. They were separatists. Not all separatists moved to America. Some stayed in England. But the separatists essentially said, there's nothing you can do to fix the Church of England. And they separated themselves from it and started their own denomination. The other group was Puritans. A group of Puritans landed in Boston in 1730. The Puritans had the same basic religious beliefs as the separatists, except they believed still that you could reform the Church of England from within. And that was their goal. The group that came to Boston, it's the term that's frequently used with this group is the city on the hill. What was meant by that was that the Puritans were going to build a city in the New World that would be a moral beacon for the Church of England and for England in general, and would show them how a community should work under God. And they believed that by doing that, that the people in England, the people in the Church of England, would see the wisdom of their point of view and would switch. I have to tell you, that doesn't happen very often, and it didn't happen here. Yes?
Doesn't that harken back to, I forget which gospel it was, but it was, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be
Yeah, that's
hidden.
where they got, where they got
Yes.
the city on the hill term from. It did come from the Bible.
Do you know what the scripture quotation is?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not. But they, over time, they realized that nothing was going to change in England. And the two groups grew together. As the colony grew, they grew together and became a single colony of Massachusetts. The group at Plymouth was originally called the Plymouth Colony, and the group in Boston was originally called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But they grew together and merged and became the colony of Massachusetts, and they merged the two groups, and they became known as Congregationalists. Now, Congregationalists is both a denomination and a manner of running the church. Congregationalist means that the church's business is voted on by the membership of the church. The pastor doesn't just say you do this or you do that, or the priest doesn't just say you do this or you do that. It's voted on by the church. The church decides what they're going to do. And they decide who's going to be their pastor and where their money's going to go and all that stuff by a vote, by a majority. There are a lot of Congregationalist churches in that sense, churches who have that type of government in the United States. It includes all Baptist churches, the Church of Christ, and there was another one. Anyway, there are a lot of these kind of churches. But there is also a Congregationalist denomination, which is what they were. They were Congregationalists in the way they ran their church, but that's what they called themselves, as the Congregationalists. And they are still around. There aren't many of them anymore, but there are still a few of those churches around. These guys were known for great sermons. The pastors of these guys were known for great sermons, and some of these sermons are genuine early American literature, just aside from any moral thing. They're genuine early American literature and absolutely fascinating reading. Some of these guys were truly great speakers. This was New England had a what they call the leveling tendency. Leveling, L-E-V-E-L-L-I-N-G, being a social term. Basically what it meant was that everybody was on the same plane. Everybody was equal. Now that's not true, of course. There's no culture anywhere that doesn't have status and various levels of classes and that sort of thing. But those classes were less distinct in New England than they were in other parts of the country. It was not uncommon for people to address, for a commenter to address a gentleman, for instance. And they were very big, they were very democratic, and they were very big on town meetings. Every town had town meetings every so often, and anybody could speak there. You didn't even have to be able to vote. All you had to do was live there, and you could speak out at these town meetings. It didn't matter what your status was or anything like that. You still could speak there, and everybody would hear what you have to say. In terms of their economics, most of these guys were small farmers, but they also did something else. They farmed on the side. They had, there were a few crops such as apples and some tree crops that they grew enough of to sell a few. But mostly the way it worked was these guys, they lived in small villages throughout the state. And outside the village, a couple of miles, would be, various farms, and everybody would own a small farm, and that farm would be farmed for your personal use, so that you could sell it and make a couple of bucks, or so that you could grow things that you needed to eat, or that sort of thing. The real money in New England came from trade. Boston was the third largest city in the colonies. It was about 20,000 people. There was a lot of trade that went on there, particularly in lumber. For one thing, in New England was one of only 2 places in the world that grew the types and size of trees needed to make masts for ships. The other one was in Scandinavia. But the country was rich in resources, and New England developed trade as their main product. One other thing that came from New England, the Congregationalists were in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The people in New Hampshire, actually, some of them were Congregationalists, but initially, New Hampshire was populated by people who left Massachusetts because they didn't like the way that things were being run in Massachusetts because of the religion. Religious government and civil government was basically one and the same. Other people that didn't leave on their own were sometimes kicked out. 2 of these were Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Williams first and then Hutchinson. Both of them were leaders of groups that did not agree always with the Congregationalist thinking. So both of them were ousted, and both of them went to Rhode Island. And they settled the first 2 colonies in Rhode Island. Unlike most of the colonies, they bought their land from the Indians. They paid full fair market value for the land as if they had bought the same land from somebody in one of the other colonies. They treated the Indians fair. What's really important about this is that both of these guys, Roger Williams was a Baptist, and Anne Hutchinson was what we would today, probably close to what today we would call a Pentecostal. But they agreed that there should not be restrictions on worship, and Rhode Island became the first colony to officially have complete freedom of worship. You could worship any way you pleased. You could not worship if you didn't want. If you wanted to not believe in God, that was up to you. That was between you and God, and not between you and the government. They were the first colony. Rhode Island was the first colony to do that. The middle colonies consisted of New York, what we now know as New Jersey, what was then called East Jersey and West Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. New York, Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Farming there, especially, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, farming there was a business. They had enough for commercial farming. They grew grain enough to sell, not just for their own use, but they grew grain enough to sell. But this area was also big on trade, and it had the two largest cities in the colonies. The second largest city was New York with about 25,000 people. The largest city was Philadelphia, which had about 30,000 people. Philadelphia wasn't just the largest city in the colonies. It was the second largest city in the British Empire. The only city in the British Empire that was bigger than Philadelphia in the 1760s and 1770s was London itself. It's the second biggest city in the British Empire. That was basically built on trade, and like New England, a lot of trade went through there. Mixed religion, again, a lot of Anglicans, but also a lot of Presbyterians and Quakers in Pennsylvania. Mixed nationalities. There were a lot of Germans that came into Pennsylvania, and some also in New Jersey. The classes weren't as distinct as in the South, but they were more distinct. New York was a Dutch colony initially, and England went to war with the Dutch over something. When they did, they took New York from them. But the people that had been living there, the Dutch people that had been living there, stayed there, and they now own most of the land. And they became, they were called patroons, and they became the large landowners in New York. And a lot of those families are still around. The one name that you would likely know from that is Roosevelt. Both Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt came from the Roosevelt family. Roosevelt is a Dutch name. They came from New York, and they were part of that old Dutch aristocracy. The southern colonies, Pennsylvania was kind of the same. It was run by William Penn. Initially by William Penn. William Penn got the colony from the king as payment for debts the king owed his father. William Penn was a Quaker, and he got both what is now Pennsylvania and what is now Delaware. Delaware was supposed to be an economic colony that would help pay the way for Pennsylvania, which was a religious colony. It was supposed to be a haven for Quakers, and for a long time that's all that lived there. Even after that was the case, even after other groups started to move in there, William Penn's ancestors ran the place, and they were the major landowners. They were the ones who held all the high spots in government. So there was a hierarchy there that was more distinct than was the case in New England, but not as much so as the southern states. The southern states included Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Both the oldest and the newest colony. Virginia was the oldest colony, established in 1607. Georgia was the newest colony, established in 1733. So just about 40 years before the American Revolution. The southern colonies were plantation-based. That is, everything turned around the plantations and the plantation owners. The plantations grew crops not to eat, but basically to sell. Tobacco, rice, which I realize you can eat rice, but they didn't grow it for that. They grew it to sell. Tobacco, rice, sugar cane. What was the other one? There was one other one, not cotton yet. Cotton didn't become popular until somewhat later. Tobacco, rice, sugar cane. Can't think of it. Anyway, they grew all of these crops were grown in abundance. They were hard to tend to, and so partly by what we talked about before when we talked about the Columbian Exchange, slavery had started, and the South became plantation-based. Slave owners, who were called planters, ran pretty much everything. There were other people. There was
Wasn't it citrus fruits?
No.
Didn't they grow citrus fruits?
They probably did, but it wasn't the main crop. I can't think of what it was, but I will probably before the period's over. Where was I here? Okay, yeah. The planters controlled everything. The classes basically were the planters, plantation owners, and their families. The middle class, which was basically artisans. We've talked about artisans before. You know what I'm talking about, right? Artisans and traders, businessmen. And then the farmers were basically the lower class economically, and then below them the slaves. But even within the slaves, there were classes. If you worked in the house, if you were a cook, a maid, a babysitter, a gardener, if you were the guy who took care of the horses, a groom, which is the guy who takes care of the horses and the buggies and that sort of thing, you know, when you were around the family all the time, you became almost like family. And then the second level in slavery was those guys who were good at something, some particular thing, some skilled labor, like they were mechanics. They could take wagons apart and put them back together, or they were wheelwrights, and they were blacksmiths, or that sort of thing. They had a higher status than did the slaves who worked in the fields. So, very class-ridden, from top to bottom, very class-ridden. Very few cities, partly because they had no manufacturing, so no real need for cities, and no real need for immigrants. So they would not grow as fast as the rest of the country once the country actually became the country. Along the coast, most of the people were Anglican. Away from the coast, back in the interior of these states, most of the people were evangelicals, Baptists, Presbyterians, Church of Christ, that sort of thing. There were a half a dozen colonial wars during the time, from the time that Massachusetts and Virginia became colonies to the time that the Revolutionary War broke out. These were all extensions of European wars. All of them were extensions of European wars. They were fought in both Europe and in the colonies at the same time. Each war, they took place, the first 5 of these wars took place between 1689 and 1755. 1689 and 1755. And they would have kind of strange names. For instance, one of them, Queen Anne's War, what it was known as in Europe, was the War of Jenkins' Ear in the colonies. It was called that because the war started when some Spanish dude cut off some English guy named Jenkins' ear. So it became the War of Jenkins' Ear. Every one of these wars had a local name as well as a world name. At the time, that didn't really mean a lot, but it kind of does to us looking back. There are a couple of things. One is that it signifies that all of these colonial wars, they were of major importance locally, not just worldwide or European-wide, but they were of major importance in the colonies. The colonies were involved in them. They fought them. They died for them. They thought they were serving England and the cause of England in these wars. So that's one thing. And the second is that it shows that these colonies had global ties. They were a big enough deal that people would fight for them as a part of the overall war. So it showed their global ties. Small armies in Europe, they had big armies and not near as much land. And they had big battles, sometimes 100,000 people in the battle, sometimes 100,000 on just one side in the battle. In the colonies, a large battle was 20,000 people. Not on the side, but total. The battles were much smaller because it was harder to supply people all the way across the ocean. You basically had to provide them, even if they could get food in America, you had to provide them with weapons and uniforms and equipment and ammunition and all of that stuff. And it was harder to do when it was across the world. They would usually send a few soldiers over, relatively few soldiers, and then they would, the militia would be added to that. The militia, every colony had a militia. You guys know what militia is? Have we ever talked about that? Do you know what militia is? Yes, no? Who knows what militia is? Okay, what's militia?
A non-government sanctioned, military regiment.
Well, it was government sanctioned, it just wasn't federal.
Well, yeah, federal, wasn't federal.
It's essentially the forerunner to our National Guard. It was a local group that could be, there was part-time soldiers that could be called out when something was needed. And militia would be called up to fight with the British, although usually they didn't fight. Sometimes they did, but they didn't fight so much as they did the work. They would haul the supplies, they would cut roads in the forest, things like that. But they, on occasion, they did fight and they did win some battles and they would gain ground, and then at the end of the war and all of the dealing and shuffling, it would almost always be given back, which upset the colonists no end. Indians were also involved in these wars. They were involved in two ways. One is they took one side or the other. If an Indian group could be cajoled or bribed into fighting for, let's say, the French, then all of their friends, all of their allies would probably fight for the French, and all their enemies would probably fight for England. And they would take sides and they would fight one another and fight France or England or whoever as just part of the regular war. But a lot of Indians, and the Cherokees were notorious for this, a lot of Indians would simply use this opportunity to attack white men, period. They wouldn't ally with anybody. They would simply attack white people and try to regain the land that had been taken from them. So there would be, in these wars, there would very often be a series of Indian wars. There would be Indians involved in the wars, and then there would be a series of Indian wars that really had nothing directly to do with it, except that because the colonies were busy fighting someone else, the Indians thought that was a good time to get involved. There was very little a permanent consequence that came out of these first 5 wars. Two things really probably were the most important. One is that the British formed a poor estimate of the colonial military. In fact, they formed a poor estimate of colonies, period. British military. They formed a poor estimate of colonial military forces, which was neither correct nor fair. Militia is not as well trained as the regulars, so they can be expected to do what regulars could do. These were men, enrollment in Great Britain was for 20 years. You enrolled there and you had plenty of time to learn the trade of soldiering. These guys were learning the trade of soldiering on the weekends, the militia, on the weekends, one weekend a month, while they were farming and running a store or something the rest of the time. So you can't expect them to be as good. But the second thing is that colonial leaders actually gained experience from these wars. They learned political experience from dealing with Britain on who was going to do what and how, but also military experience in being involved in and occasionally leading these campaigns. The last of the colonial wars, and the largest by far, was known in America as the French and Indian War. It was known around the rest of the world as the 7 Years' War. It started actually in America, and the guy who started it was George Washington. George Washington's brother had just died of tuberculosis, and George went to the governor of the state and he requested to take his brother's place as the adjutant of the Virginia militia. And even though he was only 21 years old, he got the job. And his first thing that they did was send him to Pittsburgh what was then Fort Duquesne, but you don't have to learn Fort Duquesne. Then Fort Duquesne, but we will call it Fort Pitt, which is what it was called by the English. They sent him to Fort Pitt to tell the French that that was English country and they needed to stay out of it. And the French went, yeah, sure, go home. So he went home, he reported, and they sent him back with a small army. But by the time he got back, the British were already building a fort at Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt, by the way, is where Pitt, the city of Pittsburgh, is now. That's where it got its start. It is at the beginning of the Ohio River. The Allegheny and the Monongahela River come together and form the Ohio, and right there in that fort, that's where Pittsburgh is, and that's where Fort Pitt was. In fact, there used to be a football stadium there at one time. I think now there's a park. So they were already building a fort. The French were already building a fort there when Washington showed up again. So Washington withdrew and he built his own fort called Fort Necessity. He built his little fort in a low spot in the ground with a creek running through it. Typically, forts are built on high ground. In fact, in the military, you can take it as a rule, you always want the high ground. Because you can see farther, you can shoot farther. People attack you, they have to come up the hill. If you attack them, you get the impetus of going downhill. Trust me, you always want the high ground. Washington chose a low spot with a creek running through it. Typically, again, when you set up a fort, you set it near water, but not in the water. So then he led a raid, or a reconnaissance actually, that turned into a raid. He bumped into a small French reconnaissance group, and he attacked them, and they killed, he did personally, but they killed the leader of that group, who turned out to be the younger brother of the commander-in-chief of all the French forces in North America. So he went back to his fort. By the way, from that point, the war was on. That's what started the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which is Frederick the Great and all of that stuff. He went back to his fort, and lo and behold, it started raining. And what was a beautiful trickling brook running through the middle of his fort became a rampaging river. The water was about 6 inches deep. The mud was about 8 inches deep below that. All of the food was ruined by the flood. All of the gunpowder was ruined by the flood. And then the British moved cannons up on the hills around the fort where they could just look down over the walls with the cannon. And basically Washington had no choice but to surrender, which he did. So he didn't start off great. Although, as the war progressed, he actually did pretty well. He was involved in a battle called the Battle of the Monongahela, where he commanded the rear guard and basically saved most of the Army's butt after the Army commander got killed. And he also became the commander of the Virginia militia and fought Indians on the frontier in a war which the government could not afford to support in terms of manpower or equipment adequately, which would wind up being good experience for him because he would do the same thing in the American Revolution. He ended the war becoming the most famous American soldier in the war. And that's what actually led, as we'll see, that's what actually led to him becoming commander-in-chief of the Patriot forces. The war itself was not won by big fighting or big battles. The way it was won. There are two guys named William Pitt in the war. What time does this class over?
1:26.
Okay, so what time? We started at 1:48, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay, so I should be, I need to wind up. I'm taking y'all's time, I'm sorry. Very quickly, the British had two guys named William Pitt. William Pitt the younger was the guy who defeated Napoleon. He was the prime minister in the Napoleonic Wars. William Pitt the elder, his dad, was the Secretary of State for the colonies, meaning essentially what we today call the defense secretary for the colonies, and he ran the war, and basically because the French had a bigger navy, he focused on the navy instead of the army. And he destroyed most of the French navy at a battle called Quiberon Bay. You won't have to know the name of the battle, but that's where it was. That left him and the British in charge of the seas. The French could no longer supply their overseas possessions. The British could theirs, and they could reinforce them. And eventually that led to France losing almost all of its New World possessions and almost all of its colonies, a significant hit on its colonies around the world. Oddly enough, this won the war for the British. It took the French, as you can see from the maps, it took the French completely out of North America. Oddly enough, this would be a big reason for, maybe the biggest reason for the beginning of the American Revolution, which we will talk about later. Any questions over any of this? Okay, you were on your own until the bell.